From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Friday, August 21st, 2015. In the wake of the latest Planned Parenthood controversy, we'll speak with Aspen Baker about her book, Pro-Voice, How to Keep Listening When the World Wants a Fight. And we'll be joined in studio by Eric Mann. He's the director of the Labor Community Strategy Center and its Fight for the Soul of the Cities campaign. He'll be discussing police militarization of our schools and cities. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen, sitting in for Christina Mislan. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
North Korea and South Korea are in a state of semi-war, said North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The announcement was made at an emergency meeting late last night and follows an exchange of fire over the border. The isolated North Korean regime is rankled by broadcasts that the South makes that reach over the border and criticize Mr. Kim's regime. While such cross-border war-like rhetoric is fairly common, according to the BBC, quote, this time the rhetoric is fiercer and artillery shells are now in use. South Korea's Vice Defense Minister Baek Seung-ju told the press that he thinks North Korea may try to target the border area loudspeakers that broadcast the propaganda. The U.S., which has supported South Korea against the North for decades, has remained silent, but earlier this week the two countries began their annual joint military exercises, which the North interprets as provocative. Bob, could this latest series of tensions escalate?
Well, they certainly could. Everybody understands the Korean Peninsula has been a dangerous place ever since the 1950s, the Korean War. But remember, the larger context of Asia is changing. You know, I think back maybe a quarter century ago, China was playing ball in the emerging capitalist economy of its country. Japan was playing its role as the U.S. dictated. And now things are changing. China is in flux. Japan is talking about remilitarizing. I think Asia is a very dangerous place, and this most recent provocation, shouldn't be taken lightly. There have been similar actions in the past over the last few decades that haven't led to war, but that doesn't mean that this is just one more play. This could be a really serious problem.
And the U.S.'s National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, or NOAA, has just released its latest report. The news is grim. July 2015 was the hottest month ever on record. An NOAA spokesman said, quote, the world is warming. It is continuing to warm. That is being showed time and again in our data. Many parts of the world broke their own regional records this summer. Across the Middle East and Europe, high temperatures scorched the earth. In the U.S., a record drought is in effect in California, and wildfires are plaguing the Northwest. The NOAA report follows a July study by the American Meteorological Society that concluded 2014 was on average the hottest year to be recorded. That record will likely be broken by temperatures in 2015. Bob, there's no doubting the numbers, is there? The real question, though, I think is, do enough people believe this data to push for global change to our fossil fuel-based world?
Well, this is ridiculous. We had rain here in Austin yesterday, and it's unseasonably cool today. I don't know why people are saying this thing. You know, in some ways, every time there's one of these announcements, hottest on record, excuse me, I'm rather disappointed because when we focus on weather, of course, we know we're not paying attention to climate unless we're putting it in the context of climate change, of historical patterns, which you're doing. But it's too easy, I think, for people to look outside and find the evidence they want that it's not as bad as it seems. We've got climate change denial in conservative circles where they ignore the data. But we also have a kind of climate change denial in liberal circles where we ignore the implications of the data and the fact that we are looking at massive social change. So yes, we have to pay attention to the data about specific weather patterns, but also keep in mind the really huge scope of the changes that are necessary.
And finally, the renowned Spanish judge Baltasar Garzón has announced he intends to go after corporate and environmental crimes that he considers crimes against humanity. Garzón and others will attend an international conference in Buenos Aires, Argentina, next month, where he will begin the legal effort. According to the Guardian newspaper, quote, actions that could be considered criminal include those of the so-called vulture funds that undermine countries' debt restructuring, or companies that turn a blind eye to the abusive exploitation of natural resources such as coltan used in mobile phones, digital cameras, and computers, end of quote. It is likely he will face much opposition to this approach. Still, activists around the world are lauding his efforts. Bob, how important are such efforts as Baltasar Garzon, basically going after things legally?
Well, they're important for a couple of reasons. One, let's remember there are international courts that are supposed to deal with. There's what's called the World Court, the International Court of Justice, and of course there's the International Criminal Court. Now, the U.S. ignores the former and never joined the latter, and that tells you a lot about why those institutions are ineffective. They're tools of states. And so this concept of what's called universal jurisdiction, the idea that cases can be brought from any country that believes there's a basis for the scope of this crime internationally, is really important. But it's also due to the failure of the system we have investing sovereignty in states. So I don't think it's a cure-all to the problem, but anything that gives people new tools to approach these questions is important. We still have to push states to behave more responsibly, and this may be one of the ways we can do that.
Bob Jensen, thank you so much as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin, sitting in for Christina Mislan. This is Uprising. We'll be back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. The dubiously named group Center for Medical Progress has released a number of videos of conversations with staffers at Planned Parenthood that was surreptitiously filmed to drive the ongoing debate over abortion. Claiming that Planned Parenthood engages in the sale of fetal tissue for medical research, the group has enabled conservative politicians to plan a showdown over federal funding that covers non-abortion related health services. A fifth video was just released today. On Monday, the U.S. Senate defeated a bill that would have defunded Planned Parenthood, mostly because Democrats stood firm. But more battles lie ahead, and some fear a government shutdown over the funding. But to most ordinary Americans, feelings about abortion do not easily fit within the political dichotomy that the debate has created. Rather than claiming to be pro-choice or pro-life, my guest, Aspen Baker, explores what it means to be pro-voice. Aspen Baker is the founder and executive director of Exhale. She's the author of the book Pro-Voice, How to Keep Listening When the World Wants a Fight. Welcome to Uprising, Aspen.
Thank you so much for having me, Sonali.
Now, we've had an in-depth discussion on these latest series of attacks on Planned Parenthood and these videos and what they mean and what the agenda might be of this group. But on this interview, I'm excited actually to not get into those details and to talk instead about the gap between what politicians discuss versus what Americans actually go through. First, from your perspective, how skewed is the debate in the media and in Washington, D.C. compared to real life when we talk about abortion?
As you say, there's a really large gap between the way people actually experience abortion in their own lives and then what we hear about when we clue in and get into the politics around abortion. And my background is that I had an abortion when I got out of college about 15 years ago. And I was looking for emotional support. And when I went looking for it, all I found were services available on the pro-life side, and they were all Christian-based, and they were all about seeking forgiveness from God. And when I turned to the pro-choice side, there was nothing available. And so we
Because you'd
started.
already had an abortion, so at that point, their job was over.
That is certainly what was implied and often said, actually, out loud as well. You know, that we helped you get it. It was legal. It was safe. So now it's up. You know, join us in the fight, and that's what we really need from you right now. And I thought it was strange that after all of these years of legal abortion, and how common it is that 1 in 3 women in America will have one in their lifetime, that there was so little personal conversation about abortion as an experience, as something that we went through. So the first thing that I did with my co-founders of my organization, Exhale, was create a talk line, free of judgment and free of politics, and initially free of labels. We just wanted to create a place that was safe and confidential. We were hearing people say about their own abortions was so different from what was getting discussed politically around abortion.
And so, given that we don't get to hear much about or hear stories of women and what they go through, is there any sort of typical pattern that you see? Since obviously you've now heard many women and talked to thousands of women and their abortion experiences, are there certain kinds of women who get abortions versus those who don't? One might imagine that a woman who identifies as feminist might be more likely to get an abortion versus somebody who identifies as Catholic might be less likely. Do those stereotypes even hold?
They don't hold up very well, actually. And so one thing to know about our service is that we actually talk to women and men. So we're available to people who've had abortions and their loved ones. And some of the statistics that we know about people who have abortions and the people who call our talk line is that it's really common. So 1 in 3 women will have one in their lifetime. The majority of people who are having abortions are already mothers. We also know that Catholics are some of the most likely people to have an abortion. And so you know, people come from all walks of life and have a variety of reasons and decision making. And yet what's so important for people to know is that each person's experience is unique. So there's not some single sort of universal experience, you know, like all Catholics experience abortion in this way or all feminists experience abortion in this way. And if there's anything that is common across the board for the reasons that people call our talk line, it's because they're wondering if what they're feeling and experiencing is normal. Because really the only thing we hear about is the political debate. It's hard to understand sort of where your own personal experience sort of fits in amongst the spectrum of all of these other experiences. So even, you know, someone who's calling, it's like, I feel sad, I'm not sure I did the right thing. And someone else who's calling saying, this was the best choice I've made in my life, I feel so much more confident about my future. Both of those people will call and say, am what I'm feeling normal? Do other people feel this way? And again, that's just a symbol of this gap that exists between the way that we talk about abortion in our own lives and the way that we need to versus the talking points and the sort of political arguments that we hear in public.
Has there been a reluctance from the pro-choice camp to hear about the fact that sometimes women do regret their abortions? I mean, we should just say that I'm vehemently pro-choice, but I can imagine that any decision a woman takes in her life about anything, there's always a possibility you might regret the decision.
I'm so glad that you brought up the question of regret. It's something we definitely hear about on our talk line. It is certainly it feels like a political issue for many people. I am aware of that, and so your question of like if there has been resistance from the pro-choice side at any point, there certainly has been, and mostly in the beginning of when we've started, and the pro-choice movement and many activists have come a long way, and there's so much better emotional care and emotional support that's now offered to women who've had abortions. But regret does seem to be the one really difficult place for people to acknowledge and to validate. And it's something that we think that we need to talk about, And one of the reasons is that we think the message that women who have feelings of regret need to hear is that healing is possible, that well-being is possible, that other people have had feelings of regret, that they have been able to move through that and come to another place in their life. And it doesn't mean necessarily that those feelings go away, but it is something that they can live with and have a great life with afterwards. And instead, I think what happens a lot is there's a lot of, like, regret doesn't exist, or it's made up by the pro-life side, or women who feel like it was a good decision often talk about not feeling regret. So there's sort of like a regret or not regret dichotomy that continues to happen in the same way that there's this other dichotomy that exists around abortion. And so we just want to hear from women who have feelings of regret, and we want to give them that message that healing is possible.
And of course, real life is messy, right?
Real life is messy.
And that's the issue. Women might start out having regrets and then reconcile, etc. Let's talk about how the pro-life movement has tackled the issue of women's sort of mental reaction after they have abortions, haven't they? And you've talked about this in your book, Pro-Voice. Hasn't the pro-life movement attempted to create a link between abortions and mental illness?
Yeah, so if the pro-choice movement doesn't really want to talk about or acknowledge regret, or they want to try to minimize it in some kind of way, then the opposite happens on the pro-life side, that there's an incredible focus on regret, and is really part of the reason that many activists say why abortion should be illegal, because they want to protect women from this awful feeling of regret. And so one way to protect women from going through this is to prevent them from having abortions to begin with. And so in both cases, it's really a lot of other people saying sort of what's a valid emotion or not, or how to get through it. And what we think is interesting is actually listening to people who've experienced regret and how they move through it, how those feelings changed or didn't change over time. And so that's so much about what we're about in the pro-voice movement, is creating that space for people to be able to talk for themselves and to listen to how they have navigated these challenges.
And of course, it can be very bewildering when a woman is even considering whether or not to get an abortion. Often you have these pro-life organizations, Christian organizations that parade as clinics where women might be able to get help making decisions, or even get some kind of reproductive health, and they walk in and find that they're shown horrific photographs of fetuses and bloodied abortion, just sort of the abortion horror scene, crime scene type photos, and those certainly don't benefit women either.
I think that's a really good point. It is a treacherous sort of landscape out there for women who are seeking abortions, and then women who have abortions, and there's a lot of agendas at every step about what's the right thing for a woman to do to try to prevent her from getting an abortion. And when we're talking to people on our talk line, we're often talking to people who have navigated that in some kind of way. They have walked out of a crisis pregnancy center. They have used a judicial bypass. They have figured out some kind of way to get their abortion. And I think that's an important thing for people to know, is that no matter what the obstacles are, no matter how difficult the images that get put out into the world, that women have always had abortions. They've had them when they have been illegal. They have them when they're legal. That there is always a need and a way to get an abortion. And so that's something that we talk to women on our talk line about, that this is something that lots of people have gone through for centuries.
And Aspen, the other aspect of this conversation is that abortion is not an isolated type issue. It goes hand in hand with pregnancy, infertility, miscarriage. The time of life that a woman is in determines greatly whether and her economic status. All of these things feed into the issues that are related to abortion, and also related to the desire to get pregnant, the ability to or inability to get pregnant, right? And those things are often just completely separated from abortion to its detriment.
Well, it's been really interesting. I mean, since I have written the book and I've been, traveling around the country, talking to lots of different groups, I'm mostly talking about abortion, but I find that when I talk about my own experience with abortion, I talk about the people who call our talk line, the other leaders that we've worked with, people are really responding from so many other personal places because there's so many secrets and so many things that we're not really supposed to talk about. And I think you just named a whole lot of them: infertility, miscarriage, pregnancy, becoming a parent, not becoming a parent. And all of that we have such unique and personal experiences with. And the important part is that we take a stand of empathy and compassion and create the space to let those stories come out. And the more we fight over them and the more we sort of fight politically and over public policy, it gets harder and harder for those personal stories to be revealed, because as soon as they're entered into the public debate, they get politicized. And that is so much a part of what it means to be pro-voice.
Now, you mentioned that you talk not just to women, but to men as well.
That's right.
And recently, Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, came forward and wrote a very personal blog post about his struggle and his wife's struggles with miscarriages. She's pregnant now, but had several miscarriages. And he very openly talked about it. And it was quite refreshing, actually, to hear from a man about how the fact that his wife has had so many miscarriages has impacted him as somebody who wants to be a parent. How important is that? Is that, I'm assuming, also something you classify as pro-voice?
I would absolutely think of that as pro-voice, and so important and so inspiring for where I sit, knowing how many people struggle with getting pregnant, knowing how many people struggle with miscarriage, and the men that we call, or the men that call our talk line and that we talk to, so much about their questions and their conversation is trying to understand, again, similar to women, like, is this normal? Is how she experiencing this normal? She's crying too much, shouldn't she be over it? Or she hasn't cried at all, shouldn't she be upset? Just this sense of, like, is anyone else out there going through this? And I think what Mark and his wife just did was saying, we're in this very public position, high profile, and we're letting you in and we're letting you know that we go through this too. And across the board, I think that so many of our political issues are going to be resolved because people are going to continue to speak up and to speak personally and with vulnerability, because that is an incredibly vulnerable thing to do, about what's really going on behind the scenes. And that is the kind of nuance and the kind of real life situations that's going to help everyone make better public policy decisions in the future.
Now, I've noticed that a big part of our inability, I should say, to talk about abortions and all of the things related to it is also sort of how we choose to not tackle it in pop culture, even in liberal Hollywood, which is a very pro-choice place. There are so few depictions of women actually getting abortions and being okay with them. More often than not, you see scenarios playing out in movies and on TV shows where women might have unexpected pregnancies and end up taking the difficult road of having the baby, and that is often celebrated. Is that out of touch with reality?
In a country where 1 in 3 women will have an abortion in their lifetime, yes, it's not a very good reflection of what's actually happening in people's lives. But it makes sense that pop culture and entertainment would take that path, because historically, over these last few decades, the only way that we talk about abortion is political, and so it feels like it's a political statement to show an abortion rather than show an abortion because this is what's really happening in people's lives.
Of course, it is a political
been incredible
statement
change on this.
Yeah.
MTV did a special in 2010 called No Easy Decision, shows like Parenthood, shows like Friday Night Lights, the movie Obvious Child, of course, that these are all examples of people saying, this isn't right. We know that this is happening in people's lives. We want to show this back to them. And that the way that they have approached the topic is with a lot of emotionality, actually, and a lot of emotional honesty and nuance. And when abortion stories are approached in that way in pop culture and entertainment, we find that there's actually very little controversy because people can really relate to it because they have their own emotional experience of abortion as well.
Right. I was just going to say it is a political statement, even if Hollywood doesn't think it's political, to show only or mostly, and you pointed out just a very few exceptions, but the most common expression of or depiction of women's dilemma with abortion is to not get an abortion, and choosing to show that side much more often is a political statement that they might not like to accept as political, and that also feeds into the guilt that women might feel if we do talk about it more openly. Isn't the personal decision of whether or not to get an abortion perhaps an easier decision, or might it not be an easier decision to make whether or not to get an abortion if we do talk about it more often, do see it in our media?
That is an incredibly interesting question, and I don't actually have the answer for that. I find that there's a lot of different ways that people make sense of sort of why we have the debate and what can fix it and how it should exist and how do we handle the issues of guilt and shame and regret. And one of the things that I think is important to realize is that women are very capable of acknowledging their own emotions, of building support, and of moving through them. That with or without stigma, emotions will still exist around abortion. And so how do we create the space so that women can speak for themselves and men can speak for themselves? And out of that is where the insights and the wisdom will be revealed about what we need to do next. So much about pro-voice is this combination of listening to people and being able to tell our stories and living in the complications and living in the nuances and the gray areas, because we need to resist making it such a black and white issue. We need to resist sort of drawing that battle line of are you with us or against us, because that's not going to take us to the other place.
Now, the issue of race and abortion and reproductive justice is a very important one that you also tackle in your book. And this is something that a lot of feminists of color have addressed over the years, but it's certainly worth revisiting that the fight for the right to abortion was something that white feminists took on very strongly, but among black women, the right to have a pregnancy and a child is something that has been fought for. And the pro-life movement, I think, has very cynically taken advantage of that history by putting up billboards against abortion, saying, actually even co-opting the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and asserting that abortion is equivalent to black genocide, a genocide of black people just because abortion is available. How do you navigate through that very contentious and important history?
Well, one is to acknowledge it and to listen to it and to create space for it. And I think you just outlined a lot of that history in a really important way. And certainly calling black women who have had abortions as contributing to genocide in some way is not non-judgmental. It's not supportive. It's not respectful. And it's not creating the space for women, black women in particular, to speak for themselves. And so in many ways, it's very simple to say, like, is this creating supportive and respectful atmosphere in recognition of women's well-being, or is it working to try to take that away? And we want to see more and more black women and other women of color, speaking for themselves and having the room and the space to do that, and have other people be able to listen to their needs and to their experiences.
Aspen, let's also talk about the fact that your organization has been around for 15 years, providing this space for women and men to talk about these issues. In those 15 years, have you seen more avenues open up and actually be available for people to speak up a little bit more truthfully? You gave a TED talk about your book, about what you write in your book, Pro Voice, but I understand this was the first TED Talk ever about abortion, which is kind of amazing. TED Talks cover everything, and yours was the first about abortion.
Yeah, there has been, so TED also has these TEDx events, which are independently organized, and there have been abortion mentioned and abortion stories and abortion topics in the TEDx series, but this was the first sort of main stage, organized by TED event that covered abortion. So I was fortunate to be able to deliver that at the end of May.
And so have you seen more spaces open up that are taking the cue from your organization Exhale and realizing the need for people to be able to speak up and not be judged about how they're feeling about this issue of abortion?
I have seen so much change in 15 years. It's incredible. And there's ongoing political battles, and there's ongoing stigma and shame and issues. But one of the important things about Pro-Voice is being able to notice when positive change is taking place and being able to link those things and highlight them and show when that's possible. So a few different ways that we have seen change being possible is when Exhale started, we were really the first and only, post-abortion service. And we were started by myself and other women who'd had abortions. Like, we were the patients. We were the patients of abortion clinics. And we said, there's this other thing that we need and we're not getting it. And so we're going to make it for ourselves and we're going to offer that to other people. Since then, other talk lines have started. There's a talk line called Backline. There's one called Faith Aloud. There's one called Connect and Breathe. We've seen people who've been working in pregnancy and childbirth, doulas, who've really expanded their care to serve women who are going through abortion. So there is a movement of abortion doulas, or the full spectrum doula movement. One of the most interesting things I think I've seen in just the last year or two is that some of the leaders in pro-choice organizations have really taken the step to talk openly about their own abortions. Which is not something that was super common in the past. And we've seen elected leaders. We've seen, Congresswoman Jackie Speer, and we've seen Lucy Flores, who is running for office in Nevada, and Wendy Davis running for governor in Texas. That we are seeing political, public women that, in many ways don't have to tell this personal story, opening up and doing that and making it be a part of the stand that they're taking. We've also seen on the pro-life side some incredible movement as well. They used to only sort of talk about, regret as something that you will have forever, but now we see messages that say healing is possible. We see messages from the pro-life side acknowledging that every person's experience with abortion is unique. We see services that help people build networks of support. So we've seen, change in all of those areas as well.
Well, Aspen Baker, give out a website for your organization Exhale as well as your book Pro-Voice.
We do. You can visit aspenbaker.com and exhaleprovoice.org. And on my website, aspenbaker.com, there's a listening quiz, there's a Pro-Voice pledge, there's guides on how to be a good listener and tell stories, and you can watch my TED Talk.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and we will certainly post a link to your TED Talk at our website, uprisingwithsonali.com. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for having me on.
Aspen Baker is the executive director of Exhale and the author of Pro-Voice, How to Keep Listening When the World Wants a Fight. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. In the wake of the Ferguson uprising last year, news reports began emerging of a little-known military program called 1033 that shares surplus military hardware to local police departments around the country. While the program sounds shocking, what is even worse is that police at public schools are also receiving weapons of war, such as M16s. Now, students at one school district are fighting back against the militarization and over-policing of their schools. This summer, dozens of students in Southern California confronted the Los Angeles Unified School District and demanded a list of military weapons in the district's possession. It was the latest in a series of events, hearings, and petitions. In May, President Obama signed an executive order limiting military transfers to local city and school police departments, but it's not yet clear if schools continue to retain past weapons obtained earlier under the program. In his latest article in the Huffington Post, my guest Eric Mann writes, quote, "We're calling on the Los Angeles Unified School Board and the LA Police and Sheriff's Departments to relinquish all their weapons from the 1033 program and burn them, don't return them, so they can't be used on others inside or outside the U.S. Eric Mann is the director of the Labor Community Strategy Center and its Fight for the Soul of the Cities campaign. He's the author of Playbook for Progressives, 16 Qualities of the Successful Organizer, and Katrina's Legacy, White Racism and Black Reconstruction in New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. He's also the host of KPFK Pacifica's Voices from the Front Lines, longtime civil rights activist with a history in organizations such as the Congress of Racial Equality, Students for Democratic Society, and the United Auto Workers. Welcome to Uprising, Eric.
Thank you, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first let's talk about the program itself. Even though it was adjusted by President Obama in May, certainly since May, there may have been some limits placed on it, but before May, how was this program acting? How was it filtering excess weapons that we wonder why we were producing in the first place, not only to local police departments around the country, but shockingly to schools and to school districts for police to use?
Well, we'll get back to the fact that the president's order is very weak and unenforceable, but I think the core is that the United States is at war with the black community, and as the Defense Department told me when they just wrote to me, said they wanted to make a distinction that the weapons they gave, the mine-resistant, ambush-protected, is a defensive weapon, and that's what they gave. They didn't give a tank. That's the level of distinction they want to make. The fundamental question is, why would the Los Angeles Unified School District or any school district want surplus weapons unless it's because the schools are no good, because the police are harassing people, because people don't have jobs, and they're anticipating another round of black rebellion. And this is truly a program to suppress all the young kids who are doing this great work now in the high schools about school-to-prison pipeline, about racist education. And it is, as he said, the guy from the Defense Department, well, these were originally used in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it is part of a counterinsurgency program.
Has there been, as far as you know, an actual deployment of such weapons in schools, in any public school system in the U.S. yet?
Don't know if they've actually been deployed, but we do know that, for instance, the Los Angeles Unified Schools District presently has 61 M16s. M16s were declared by the Red Cross an inhumane weapon because that should be outlawed, because the attack on the body is not just fatal, but destroying virtually every organ. So the fundamental question is political, which is, why would Ramon Cortinas, the head of the school board in Los Angeles, why would Steve Zimmer, the chair of the board, still either defend or not get rid of 61 M16s? We know that the tanks have been used in Ferguson. We know that the Los Angeles Police Department has many more than 61 M16s.
1,600, I
1,600.
Wow.
It was in my article. Good. And yeah, I should read my own stuff. And what are they going to do with 1,600 M16s? So the question is, as we said to the school board, you only got them to use them. They're not surplus for you. So the students have been rising up in the Los Angeles Unified School District, but I want to be clear that the first thing is the president's order said, in the future, we will prohibit the use of 1033 weapons in school boards. We went back and checked. There's no order to return everything that they got.
Right, so let's talk about what the president said in May. Essentially, to great fanfare, the president announced that there would be limits placed on this program, the Pentagon surplus program. But of course, first of all, it doesn't end the program completely.
Right.
And second of all, it does not require the return of these weapons. And so schools that already received them, that already got them, such as LAUSD, as far as you know, get to keep them.
That's our understanding. I was just talking to the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, with whom we're working on this national campaign. By the way, the main goal is to get President Obama to end the entire program, because we're saying no tanks in Detroit, no tanks in Philadelphia, no tanks in Houston. And the second thing is that his executive order said, before you get more weapons, you're going to have a 2-page application instead of a 1-page application. Still allows them to sell these weapons to each other. So you get a surplus weapon, and if LA wants to sell it to New York to suppress people, they're allowed to do it.
So keeping them in circulation.
Keep them in circulation. So let's be clear. I like reforms. I like real reforms. We read it with a fine-tooth comb. If it was great, that would be great. But even our own organization, somebody called me up, hey, President Obama ended the 1033 program. And then we went, not only didn't he end it, but he created such confusion that as an organizer, we have to tell people, no, it's doing very well, thank you very much. And we still can't get, like, Superintendent Cortina sent us a letter saying, we want you to know we have discontinued our participation in the program. Now, what kind of vague stuff is this after 15 letters back and forth? We said, are you in the program? Do you still have the weapons? And that's what we need the public to help us with.
So you, the students that you work with and that your organization works with, confronted the school board and asked for a list.
That's right.
Just a list of what weapons the school board, the school district owns. Military weapons, which doesn't seem to be a terribly radical request. Just tell us what you have that could be deployed against our children.
That's right.
And they're not telling you.
Well, one thing that's interesting, because at the Strategy Center we're doing what we call deep organizing. So you have to see that Ashley Franklin is leading Michael Davis, Laura Aguilar, along with Manuel Criollo, Barbara Lott Holland. These students are phenomenally well trained.
These are names of students, yeah.
Well, no, the first, Michael Davis and Laura Aguilar are students. Ashley Franklin is an organizer working at Manual Arts High School and at Augustus Hawkins High School. Michael Davis and Laura Aguilar are the two most prominent spokespeople of the students. But in listening to them, they're so well educated, as it were, about the entire program that they're saying, they have shirts saying, I am not bulletproof. And they know the program. And the school board went into closed session. They didn't even deal with them. So we're meeting with all the school board members. I think they're feeling the heat. And I think our goal is we need a victory.
Now, the issue of these weapons even being in existence in the United States, circulating between police departments and school districts, is also bizarre to begin with. These are military weapons. You don't just want them to be returned. You're calling on the weapons to be destroyed.
Well, it's even broader, as they say, don't you have a broader agenda? Absolutely. Our goal is to disarm the police in the United States. That's our goal. I was just in a meeting, Sonali, where people from maybe more moderate civil rights organizations who had worked to try to get what they call memoranda of understandings with police departments in the schools are now saying, I hate to say it, but it's time to say we don't want the police in the schools. You can't, and they said, I tried, but I am understanding the structural problem is we can't have police in the schools. Secondly, we can't have regular weapons. They said, well,
forget the military stuff.
Forget about the military stuff. The hardware, the police department, Los Angeles School Police Department, the LAPD, before the 1033 program, they are armed to the teeth. So we are saying get rid of 1033 because it will be symbolic and significant. But now we warned them, and then we want to discuss every weapon that you have and discuss why do we have armed police in the schools. So,
and this is not just an LA issue, this is around the country. There are, depending upon which city you live in, depending upon which neighborhood you live in, routinely there may be armed police patrolling the schools that your kids go to.
There are armed police. The only distinction is whether it's a school police, which is Los Angeles, to its great credit, that's a joke, has its own school police department and a Los Angeles Police Department and an LA Sheriff's. But if you're in Houston or if you're in Dallas or if you're in New York, if you're in Seattle, you'd have to check out, because if you don't have a school police department, that means your local police department is patrolling the schools. So there are police in every school in the United States.
And so there is obviously a broader issue. The issue that is plaguing our streets are also plaguing our schools, where we do have armed police. Just as the tanks rolled in on the streets of Ferguson when people rose up, if there are times when schools have such flare-ups, or for whatever reason there may be a reason that school districts might think we need to get people under control, it's possible we might see military-grade weapons being brought into schools as people on the streets of Ferguson saw them, because they haven't told you what they have necessarily, and they certainly haven't made a move to give them back.
Well, one thing I think is very important is that one reason this is going on is because there's just a complete absence of white support for black students and
black and brown
students. These students, we were in the bus riders union, as you know, for 15 years fighting with the Los Angeles MTA as a national campaign. We've been asking people, please come down to the MTA, help us take on these elected officials like Mayor Garcetti. And as I say, in Los Angeles, if we say that for the white West Side, they think Fairfax is the East Side. They think South is the Marina. No, South is South Los Angeles. East is East LA. In every city in the country, there's been a tremendous chasm between white progressives who are only interested in, if I may say, in Bernie Sanders' economic populism, but are not interested in the shooting of black and brown students. So we need people to call the Strategy Center 213-387-2800, to write to me at Eric at Voices from the Frontlines. If you're in any city in the country, we want to talk to you, because this is a national campaign. If you're in LA, we want you to make calls. And I've been listening, Sonali, to a terrific civil rights tape with Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee, and going back mainly into the 60s. I was struck by how in Mississippi and Alabama they said, why are people calling us from all over the country? This is a local issue. Stay out. I'm not going to use my bad Southern imitation. But so is Mayor Garcetti saying that. So is the school board, Steve Zimmer, saying this is an LA issue. It is not an LA issue. We need people from all over the country to say we want the LAUSD to give up these weapons as a test case, and then go into their own school board and say whether it's the weapons are from our school police or the local police, do you have 1033 weapons that you're going to use against students?
How important is the fact that this is a student-led effort?
Well, the Strategy Center is a multi-generational organization. We organize in the high schools, we organize on the buses, we organize 80-year-old Korean grandmothers and 60-year-old black women on public assistance. We don't glorify youth as an absolute category, but all revolutions are strongly student-driven, and we've been working in the high schools with our community rights campaign because these young people we just had a Freedom Summer with 30 young black and Latino kids run by Ashley Franklin and Manuel Quioyo, where they did political education on colonialism, on organizing tactics, on how to build a group. What I'm getting to is I think a lot of the young people know how to protest, but we really want to help them learn how to organize. And right now, they have 18-year-old teachers.
Yeah. And that's part of the connection as well, right? When we have poor quality schools that are over policed, those two things are linked.
Yeah, and I was listening to the Black Panther Party 10-point program, and they said, we want an education program that teaches people the true nature of the system. And that you're going to get from civil rights groups. That you're going to get from the Strategy Center. We want improvements. Certainly, we want literacy programs in the high school, but we also want there was just a big victory in LAUSD about ethnic studies. That was a great victory because we didn't just want better literacy. We wanted ethnic studies, and the Strategy Center worked with some terrific groups that were doing that. I think it's been proven that if you ask a Black and Latino kid to read about ethnic studies, their literacy will be much more interesting than if you ask them to lead Western civilization. So the relationship it's been proven, the relationship with literacy and interest. People read when they want to read it. So yes, there's a crisis in the actual education system, ideologically as well as technically. There's a crisis of massive underfunding. There's a crisis of policing. There's a crisis that the kids are coming in hungry. There's a crisis that they're coming in from families it's a miracle that these families are hanging together. These kids are wonderful. They're really amazingly courageous young people, and they're fighting the whole system. They're not just fighting to get the police out.
And in the organizing, there's, of course, much educational value in the making of these links. There's amazing educational value in seeing, and I say education, not just book smarts, but learning how the world actually works. How has the school board responded or not? I mean, the efforts that we've been talking about that were the most recent efforts led by students and organizers was just part of a series of correspondence that you've had with the school board. Have they ignored you? Have they given some response?
Well, what's disappointing about this, and this is, please hear the song Love Me, Love Me, Love Me, I'm a Liberal by Phil Oakes, that this is liberal Democrats. And liberal Democrats in some ways don't think that there's George McKenna, who's a member of the board, Steve Zimmer, Monica Garcia. These are good people in many ways. But they feel a certain righteousness about, well, I'm not a racist. I couldn't, we didn't say you're a racist. We said the policy is racist. And yes, good people can carry out racist policies. So we're closing in on them. We sort of, organizing is like they make a move, it's a chess game. They make a move, we make a move. We're winning the battle of ideas. They can't defend it, which is why they went into closed session.
Now, how do you defend having military?
I need this looking at students saying, you don't understand, you are the main danger. You are the person I'm afraid of. And I need weapons. I need an M16 because if I ever need to shoot you. And the students are saying, and then the next day we're supposed to talk about educational reform, or the next day you think I trust you. So I think we need more public attention. If we win this, and I think we will, that's how history is made. So now, we need victories, not protests. We need protests, but we need protests and organizing and victories. And we need to, power is the ability to get people to do something they don't want to do.
How would you encourage those in our listening and viewing areas outside of LA to find out what's in their schools and to organize in similar ways? Because this is the 1033 program, which is the Pentagon's military surplus program, is and was a national program.
Well, the good news is that the Strategy Center is heading up a national campaign to ask President Obama to get rid of the 1033 program. Strategy Center is also going to work with groups all over the country. If you want to write to us, we'll give you all the websites. You can get this information. We're working with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. We just was on a conference call with Dignity in Schools where they're saying each chapter is going to have to vote, but with tremendous enthusiasm. We're working with the Appleseed Project in Texas. So we're very close, meaning in a week, to putting out a national call. One, ask the president, and number two, look at every city in the United States, and we will help you inventory the 1033 weapons in your own city.
And so why is President Obama specifically the one who can end this? I mean, he certainly signed an executive order. Could he have, in that executive order, just simply ended the program and demanded everything be returned?
Well, among my, why I drive people crazy because I'm a writer is I always have articles in my head. And one of them is called President Obama, the Elephant in the Civil Rights Bathtub. And one of the problems is that if this was George Bush, there would be much more outrage. I'm happy that President Obama was elected. I mean that. I'm happy he's president of the United States rather than Mitt Romney. But his ability to co-opt, his ability to come up with these paper orders and so little outrage, he's called the commander-in-chief. Now, I wish he wasn't, but if he's willing to use drones to assassinate people, yes, he has the absolute legal authority to say the program is over. That's it. The same executive order that modified it can be changed to say, I've decided to end the program. So that's what's good about it. All the Democrats will say, well, his hands are tied, we have to win the Congress back. No, he has executive power to do so many things. Please see George Bush. George Bush didn't worry about things like that. So let's be clear. President Obama can, with a stroke of a pen, end the 1033 program. He's the primary I would say, target of this campaign.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Eric, for joining us today. And that does it for our program. My guest is Eric Mann. He is the director of the Labor Community Strategy Center and its Fight for the Soul of the Cities campaign. He's the author of Playbook for Progressive 16 Qualities of the Successful Organizer and Katrina's Legacy, White Racism and Black Reconstruction in New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, and the host of KPFK's Pacifica's Voices from the Front Lines. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Teddy Robinson is our audio engineer. Special thanks to Stan Mizrahi for technical assistance. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.